So I've been binging a lot of Zelda theories over the past few days, and it made me realize two things. First, every single theory I've tried to think of on my own for this video had already been thought of, and second, there's a lot of confusion over how all the worlds of the Zelda multiverse connect to each other. Because of this, I wanted to take a crack at explaining and visualizing it in a way that can hopefully help some people out to understand this janky multiverse a little bit better. Not only that, but the multiverse of Zelda seems to behave pretty similarly to how our multiverse might work. If it's even real and not a simulation, who even knows? So this lesson of video game quantum physics might help you think about your own world in a slightly different way. But before I get into fun video game physics, let's talk about boring real-life physics. To start, look all around where you are right now. Unless you're in public, because that would be weird. Notice how there's a forward, a backward, a left, a right, up, down, all sorts of diagonals. That's what we understand as 3D space. Now imagine where you were an hour ago compared to where you are now. All the separate individual instances of your 3D space that took place between those two moments are a piece of your 4-dimensional timeline. And the 4th dimension, according to superstring theory, is time. And we do not have enough time to get into superstring theory, so you can look that up on your own if you're interested. Time is what allows the 3rd dimension to move from state to state, and as you're moving through time, you're creating a 4D timeline. An entire 4-dimensional timeline extends uninterrupted from the beginning of that universe all the way to the end of that universe. This idea is most of what allows the split timeline to exist at all. So let's say you could walk forward and backward 4th dimensionally in the same way that you can walk down a hallway. Well, then you'd be able to travel back and forth through time at will. This is what happens in moments like when Link pulls out the Master Sword or puts it back in. He's traveling using the 4th dimension. It's the same thing as in Majora's Mask whenever you play the Song of Time. I'll get into higher dimensions in a minute, but first let's back up to the beginning of the Zelda universe for a clearer picture. First, there was a void of chaos. But then, the Golden Goddesses descended to create the world that they wanted. Din created the physical realm, Nehru gave it law and rules, and Ferror gave it life that follows these laws. But, like the time I picked my wife a bouquet of flowers that was riddled with bees, sometimes nice actions have unintended consequences. When the goddesses created Hyrule, they also created an entire multiverse by accident. This is what allows not only our lovely Hyrule to exist, but infinite other worlds with different beginnings and different endings to exist, all at the same time. The goddesses also didn't do a very good job of stitching these worlds onto their own individual line, because the chaos of space-time likes to overlap the fabric of certain realities with other ones whenever it decides. Nehru really dropped the ball on that one. The goddesses creating the universe is essentially the Hyrule equivalent to the Big Bang in the possibly real world that we live in, and it created a multiverse that became spread out into infinite realities, but the classic timeline that we all know and love is the one that the games focus on. Now, let's use what we just learned to look at the official classic Zelda timeline. Actually, let's just scratch these two off for now, just to make this hypothetical a bit easier to understand. If we imagine that the downfall timeline is the one true timeline, then that means we treat everything from the Big Goddess Bang to Skyward Sword, right up to the end of Zelda 2, as one unbroken timeline. Everything up to Ocarina of Time happens, Link dies, which is canon, and the timeline continues from there. But Michael, I hear you saying, how can Link die in one timeline but not the two others? Well, let me tell you, stranger in my head, that's where the 5th dimension comes into play. Every time something with free will makes a choice, a whole new timeline is created because of that choice. And infinite simultaneous timelines are also created where you did literally anything and everything else. Most of the time these universes will sort of collapse back onto themselves. Like if you have Fruit Loops instead of Fruity Pebbles, you created a whole new universe, but if the consequences of that action have no lasting effects, then these universes will continue and eventually become more or less identical again. But if instead of Fruit Loops you chose to eat the 4-day-old clam chowder that was in your fridge, which then gives you food poisoning and you have to miss your nephew's 3rd birthday, even though Sarah said you can't miss it because this is your last chance to be a part of the family, Michael, then that choice had enough of an impact to toss you into a completely different series of events, and therefore a whole new timeline. Link could essentially fail at any point on his journey in Ocarina of Time, and all of those possibilities will converge with the downfall timeline. But if Link does not die and is able to defeat Ganon, then that's definitely a big enough change for a whole new timeline. But since you were also time traveling the whole time, which is what allowed you to defeat Ganon, you created a weird rift of timelines. The one that continues from when Link was a child, and the one that you forced into being by interacting with a different future that you had to leave. Both equally real and both equally parallel in the grand scheme of things. And what do I mean by parallel? I mean parallel in the 5th dimension. 100 years after Link dies in the Downfall timeline is parallel to 100 years after Ganon is defeated in the Child timeline. And if one of the Zelda games wanted to, you could totally travel 5th dimensionally between any of these 3 timelines. Which may have already happened, but I'll get to that. The adult timeline continues normal as well, but since it was a future timeline, the events will permanently be shifted forward by 7 years. So if you were to travel to that timeline, you'd probably be about 7 years behind where you expected to end up. Now, hopefully we have a pretty firm understanding of how these 3 timelines relate to each other, and since they can all be traced back to the same events that transpire in Skyward Sword and the founding of Hyrule, that means that the same world is being explored in most of these games. For the sake of convenience, we'll just call this the primary universe. Every Link we ever play as comes from one of these 3 timelines, so calling it that should keep things pretty simple. Now, since this Hyrule is always technically the same world that we're exploring, that means that in games where Link visits other countries, he's still in the same physical realm that links back to Skyward Sword. So places like Labrynna, Holodrum, the Great Sea, and even New Hyrule exist in this primary timeline world. But inside this primary universe, there are also several subworlds, or whatever you may want to call them, which are scattered across space and time. The most iconic and well-known of these subworlds has to be the Sacred Realm. The Sacred Realm was created when the Golden Goddesses left the universe that they created, and at the point that they departed, they created the Triforce and the whole Sacred Realm just to contain it. It seems from references in the games that the Sacred Realm was basically a beautiful but empty void of golden skies which contained only the Triforce. It wasn't until after the Interloper War that the Light Sage, Rauru, created the Temple of Time inside the Sacred Realm to house and protect the Triforce. The Temple of Time in the main world connects to the Temple of Light, and it's one of the only ways to enter the Sacred Realm. The Sacred Realm's timeline is permanently attached to the timeline that it exists in because it runs parallel all the time, meaning with every break in the timeline, the Sacred Realm will shift with it. This means that the Sacred Realm of the Wind Waker is not technically the same Sacred Realm as the one in A Link to the Past, even though a few thousand years ago they were one and the same. The Sacred Realm will also sometimes take the form of the Dark World, also known as the Evil Realm. This happens when someone with an evil heart is able to access the Sacred Realm and touch the Triforce, causing the entire Sacred Realm to morph and reflect that person's desires. This happens in A Link to the Past, where you gain the ability to travel back and forth between the 2 realms more or less at will, and in this case the Sacred Realm became an evil version of Hyrule that's ruled completely by Ganon because that's what he desired most. The same thing also potentially happens in Four Swords Adventures, but it's unclear if the Dark World in that game is a warped Sacred Realm or a separate shadow dimension altogether. It definitely behaves differently than the Sacred Realm, and it also behaves differently than the Twilight Realm from Twilight Princess. In Four Swords Adventure, you can see shadows of objects in this Dark Realm that you can interact with, and you can see changes between the 2 realms. Moon Pearls are also required to enter the Dark World, which is different than in A Link to the Past, where the Moon Pearl just allows you to maintain your human form while in the Dark World. So I think it's safe to say that it's just some sort of separate, individual, parallel Shadow Realm. I think the same can probably also go for the Dark Realm found in Spirit Tracks, as well as the Dark Realm that was mentioned in the Oracle games, which is where Twinrova summoned the main villains of those games from. However, Spirit Tracks, the Oracle games, and Four Swords Adventures all take place in different timelines, so it's definitely possible that it's some sort of Shadow Realm that's as linked to the main universe as the Sacred Realm is. And in each timeline shift, the Dark Realm will change just a little bit with the Light World to bring in all sorts of baddies whenever Destiny calls for it. Moving on, in the primary timeline's Child timeline, we also see the Twilight Realm, which is a realm created by the Light Spirits with the specific purpose of sealing the Interlopers at the end of the Interloper War. The Twilight Realm presumably only exists in the specific reality that it was created in, which would put the Twilight Realm's inception at some point between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, which is when the Interloper War is thought to have happened. This means that the Twilight Realm probably exists in every branch off the main timeline, even though we only hear about it or visit it during the Child timeline. The Twilight Realm exists parallel to both the Sacred Realm and the Overworld, without naturally interacting with any of them. Next, let's quickly cover the next main subworld, the Silent Realm from Skyward Sword. It's not exactly clear what the Silent Realm is. Some people believe it to be an early version of the Sacred Realm, but Hyrule Historia refers to it as a spirit world that only the chosen hero can enter. This makes it seem more like it's a pocket dimension that mirrors the areas that Link enters specifically for the trials. And if the light spirits can create an entire Twilight Realm, then the goddesses, or even Hylia, could probably create these little temporary pocket dimensions. Next, hopping over to the adult timeline, there's the world of the Ocean King. This is the world that Link and Tetra are transported to in Phantom Hourglass. It's a world very similar to the Great Sea, except time moves much slower, or I guess faster depending on how you look at it. Because at the end of the game, you find out that they were only gone for a few minutes. One theory I have about where this is in the multiverse is that it's an alternate timeline created when the Great Flood occurred, where Ganon never attacks during Wind Waker. This makes sense in a world where Ganon gets sealed permanently at the end of Ocarina of Time, so he never attacks in Wind Waker and a Link never needed to be born to fight him. Then Bellum attacks in Phantom Hourglass, but there isn't a hero to fight it in this timeline, so a Link from a very similar world was pulled in. But I also found this theory from the user Boido on Zelda-verse.net that talks about how the world of the Ocean King could possibly be the termina of the adult timeline. He reasons that when Hyrule got flooded, it's possible it flowed into Termina and turned it into scattered islands the same way it did with Hyrule. Also the fact that Tingle is somehow in Majora's Mask and the Wind Waker, so if there was a connection from the Great Sea to a flooded Termina, then Tingle could have made the trip at some point. Boido obviously goes into more detail, but it's an interesting read, and I put a link in the description if you want to check it out. So in conclusion, either the world of the Ocean King is a break in the timeline right here, or a timeline-shifted version of Termina, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. The last of the primary universe's subworlds is Coholint Island, which is a literal dream world and doesn't technically exist on any timeline, besides exactly where the dream is occurring. It's a world created by the intense power of a tormented deity, pulling in a hero to aid it. Simple stuff, and not a lot to talk about, so I'll just make a bubble right here connected to Link's Awakening. At this point, we've covered more or less the entire known extent of the fifth-dimensional spacetime of the primary universes, including its many subworlds. And by the fifth dimension, I mean a plane of parallel four-dimensional timelines. Now I ask you, if you could use the fourth dimension to travel forward and backward in time, what if you were to travel using the fifth dimension? Well, my little academic. That would be what happens if you travel left and right in time. That's what would happen hypothetically if Link was to travel between two timelines. But in certain games, Link travels to areas that exist completely outside of this main world. But Michael, I hear you start before I interrupt, because friend, this is where things get really fun. The sixth dimension. The sixth dimension is when you travel up and down in time, as weird as that sounds. For a visual, it might help to picture this image as a big, flat, five-dimensional plane of possible timelines. If you could travel left and right, you could travel to a universe where something like the Holocaust never happened. However, if you traveled up and down in time, you might find yourself in a timeline that has the same beginning, which is the Big Bang, but where something completely different happened so early on that it set this timeline on a completely different course. Like if that pesky meteor never killed the dinosaurs, or maybe even a world where Genghis Khan never pillaged Europe and Asia. Something that wildly different and far in the past would change literally everything about the world as we know it today. That's the sixth dimension. Now what world in the Zelda universe could that be, you may be asking yourself? Well, that answer's not entirely easy. There are many theories about what, or where, or when Termina is. Link is definitely not dead for this adventure, it's not a dream, and it's probably not Lorule, even though there are some good arguments for them being in the same world. Like in this theory on YouTube by Loxton and Noggin. They bring up points like how both worlds have an affinity for masks, both worlds are in decline, both worlds have doppelgangers of our primary timeline, and also there's that dang Majora's Mask on the wall in Link Between Worlds. But then you have opposing arguments, like how everyone in Lorule has different hair, and Majora's Mask never shows a Lorule Triforce, not even in the 3D remake. Although you do see a Triforce, so I guess depending on how you want to look at it, it could be upside down, right? I just think it's more likely that Lorule has its own Termina, or something similar connected to it. Whether it's the same Termina, or maybe an identical yet different Termina that's just linked to Lorule instead. Anyway, I've talked too much about Lorule in the Termina section, so let's move back to Termina. Termina is confirmed to be a parallel dimension to Hyrule that can be accessed through portals like in the Lost Wedge, or potentially even the Stone Tower. This is a world with its own people, even though they look like people in Hyrule, its own history, and its own religions. There's also Triforce imagery in Ikana Valley, so it's entirely possible that this is another branch of the world after the Big Goddess Bang. If this is true, then this is probably where you'd end up by traveling up and down in time through the sixth dimension. It's a universe with the same start, but is in a drastically different timeline. But there's a great theory by Monster Maze on YouTube about how the Stone Tower might have acted as a portal to Hyrule or some other dimension. This could make sense if Termina originally had no Triforce and maybe they were trying to invade Hyrule to take it, but without any confirmation there's no real way to know. So if this theory is true, it would place Termina in a completely different point in space-time with a different Big Bang event, which would mean that it exists in the 7th dimension. Speaking of, the simplest way to think of the 7th dimension would be a universe with a different beginning. In real life, this could be applied to a Big Bang that created a universe with a slightly different speed of light, or even one extra particle. As long as the inception of that universe was different, it has a completely different bubble of possibilities, and that bubble contains every possible 6 dimensions that could stem from that Big Bang. The 7th dimension in Zelda would be a universe that was not created by the goddesses, such as possibly Termina, or it could even be a universe created by the goddesses where they made a different choice right at the start of the universe. Just one little thing that would make that world completely different. Something like flipping the Triforce upside down. Lorule is very likely to be in the 7th dimension relative to Hyrule, a universe that is almost completely identical besides its flipped Triforce. Not only that, but after what we can assume was the Lorulean version of Skyward Sword, the people of the sky settled into Lorule. After some time passed, they also had a sort of interloper war like Hyrule did, but instead of doing everything they could do to protect the Triforce, they destroyed it instead. This takes their near identical history and sends it down a very dark and different path. Also, side note, since the interlopers weren't sealed away in this universe, that means that Lorule probably does not have a Twilight Realm. Anyway, without the power of the Triforce, Lorule's reality started to crumble, and its fissures rippled through space and time, creating cracks in the primary Hyrule's downfall timeline's reality. This is what allows travel between the two wildly different timelines across the 7th dimension. Meanwhile, Termina has always at least had the seemingly permanent portal underneath the clock tower. Just another reason for why they're probably different places. Our primary Link uses his Triforce to wish for Lorule to gain a new Triforce, which saves its reality. Then, Princess Hilda severs the connection between the worlds, sending them both back onto their uninterrupted timelines in their own separate universes. So the 7th dimension seems to be as far away as we travel in the series. Once we get up to the 8th and 9th dimensions, those would basically just be alternate versions of Termina or Lorule, and also any other universes that started in a different way than our primary Hyrule. And lastly, the 10th dimension is a sort of multiversal catch-all. Any universe that could exist exists in this big 10-dimensional bubble, as well as any possible variants on any of those universes. Nothing can exist outside of it because as soon as it tries to happen, it falls back into this multiverse magnet. In the context of the Zelda games, I can only think of 3 examples that would fit into the strange, impossibly far away edge of the Omniverse. Gee! Gamelon, Korodai, and Tolomak are 3 countries that all exist in a hell world of which we do not speak its name. It exists far and deep away in the hidden corners of the 10th dimension, and so we don't have to worry about it. With this slightly more completed multiverse chart of the Grand Zelda world, look at this big 10-dimensional bubble surrounding anything and everything that could and will ever exist. But what exists outside of it? Presumably some sort of idea of heaven exists, as it's mentioned by deities and characters all throughout the series, as well as some concept of an underworld. It's not clear if the underworld is actually a hidden piece of the Omniverse that demons come from, or if they come from outside of reality altogether. The intro to Skyward Sword does claim that Demise emerged from a crack in the ground. This could mean that he came from the underworld and somehow broke into our reality, but it's led others to believe that Demise comes from Lorule or maybe even Termina, but that's a topic for another day. It's also very likely that beyond the bubble is where the goddesses came from. They exist outside of this circle and are the reason that the circle exists at all. Why did they do it? Who knows? What happened to Kume and Kotake when they died, gained halos, and flew away? Who freaking knows? Did Demise exist in a completely different dimension than the goddesses, or in the same dimension? Who knows? Many of the games mention the heavens and the underworld, and even a gap between dimensions, which is very vague and rightfully so. Having all the answers is fun for like 10 minutes, but if you can speculate forever, then you'll never be bored. And to clarify, this is my understanding of how it all fits together, because Nintendo has only confirmed the 3 timelines of the primary universe, and I just thought it would be fun to try and piece the rest of it together for this video using what theories I know of for our multiverse. It could even turn out that the Zelda multiverse doesn't behave like ours at all. In fact, I have a whole different theory about what it might be, which I might make a video about someday if people are interested. Either way, this whole video may have been a pointless thought experiment, but we'll see what happens. If I missed anything or got something wrong, or if you have your own ideas for how things could fit together, then leave a comment. You can also subscribe if you'd like. My last uploads were 3 years ago, so you'll probably forget you were even subscribed to me by the next time I upload, so what's the harm? I also stream on Twitch sometimes, so you can follow the link in the description to follow me over there if you like as well. So that's about it. Bye.